All right, so let's review what we were talking about on Friday before we get into finishing these notes here. We started off working on the vocabulary for the parabola. Parabola being the name that we give to the shape of the function. So anytime we're graphing a quadratic, that becomes a parabola. Axis of symmetry is the line that divides the parabola into two congruent halves. It's an imaginary line, which is why it's drawn in as a dotted line. Vertex is the point that's either the lowest point of the graph or the highest point of the graph, depending on which way it is opening. And then that bottom right-hand box, x-intercepts, roots, zero, solutions. Those are all the same words for where does it cross the x-axis, and we will get into those a little bit later. We have two different forms of the quadratic. We have the standard form, which is ax squared plus bx plus c. And we have the vertex form, which is f of x equals a times the quantity x minus h squared plus k. When it is in vertex form, the h and the k are telling us what the vertex of the parabola is, which also means we know what our axis of symmetry is, because our axis of symmetry and our vertex share the same x coordinate. All right, then we looked at what is called the parent function, or the most basic graph of that function. For linear, it's f of x equals x. For quadratic, it's f of x equals x squared. And the reason that those are called parent functions is because every other quadratic that we graph is some type of transformation of this graph. All right, then we start getting into some of the vocabulary. Axis of symmetry, we said we're going to abbreviate it as AOS. The line that divides the parabola into two congruent halves, and again, we draw it as a dotted line because it's not actually part of the graph. It is an invisible line that is dividing that graph into half. The axis of symmetry always passes through the vertex. Our vertex has to be on our axis of symmetry. And the formula to find that when we are in standard form is x equals negative b divided by 2a. Vertex. Vertex is the highest or lowest part of the graph. When it is the highest part of the graph, we call it an absolute maximum. When it is the lowest part of the graph, we call it an absolute minimum. And to find the vertex, we take that negative b divided by 2a, that's our x coordinate, and the function of it is our y coordinate, or we take that x coordinate and substitute it in to find our y coordinate. How do we know which way a parabola will open? If the a value is positive, it opens upward, and then our vertex is known as an absolute minimum. If the a value is negative, the vertex is known as an absolute maximum, and our parabola opens downward. So we're looking at that a value to know which direction does it open up. All right, then on Friday we started looking at examples that says use the formulas to determine the vertex and axis of symmetry for each quadratic function. Then draw a rough sketch of the parabola on the graph provided. So we looked at f of x equals x squared plus 10x plus 15. In this case, a would be 1, b would be 10, and c is 15. So we use those values to find our axis of symmetry. Negative 10 divided by 2 gave us an axis of symmetry of negative 5. We drew our dotted line at negative 5 there. We did renumber our y-axis so that our vertex would fit, because once we substituted that negative 5 into the quadratic equation, we found out that it equaled negative 10, and that gave us our vertex at negative 5, negative 10. And then we drew a rough sketch. Rough sketch means we knew this was going to open upward because a was positive, so we knew it opens upward just from the a value being positive. And we just drew at that vertex a parabola facing upward. So let's look at the second problem here. F of x equals negative 2x squared minus 8x minus 15. What is the value of a in this equation? Negative 2. What is the value of b? Negative 8. And the value of c? Negative 15. If a is negative 2, does this parabola open upward or downward? It's going to open down. It's negative, which means it's going to open downward. If it's positive, it opens upward. Negative, it opens downward. So we already know what direction our parabola opens based on the value of negative 2. Now we have to find our axis of symmetry. Where is this parabola being divided in half? So again, x equals negative b divided by 2a. You have to be cautious here because b is a negative value. So this is really negative 8 divided by 2 times negative 2. You already have a negative in the formula. When you substitute a negative in, you end up with a double negative, which ends up giving me positive 8 divided by negative 4, which gives me negative 2. So my axis of symmetry is the line x equals negative 2. Whatever I get over here, that's what's telling me my axis of symmetry. So at negative 2, I'm going to draw in that dotted line. I know my vertex has to be somewhere on that line because that is the line that divides the parabola into two congruent halves. So the vertex must be on that line. So I'm going to substitute that negative 2 back into my original equation and find out what y equals. So f of negative 2 equals negative 2 times the quantity negative 2 squared minus 8 times negative 2 minus 15. You have to make sure you're putting parentheses around that negative 2. Bless you. So we get f of negative 2 equals negative 2 times positive 4, because negative 2 squared means negative 2 times negative 2, which is positive 4. Negative 8 times negative 2 is plus 16 minus 15. So f of negative 2 is negative 8 plus 16 minus 15. So f of negative 2 is 8 minus 15. So f of negative 2 equals negative 7. So my vertex is the ordered pair negative 2, comma, negative 7. Again, the negative 2 comes from my axis of symmetry. The negative 7 comes from the substitution process there. So at negative 2, negative 7, I put in my vertex. I know my parabola opens downward, and they just asked for a rough sketch, so I'm just going to roughly sketch in a parabola. We will learn in the next lesson about graphing parabolas. All right, the last one here, determine the axis of symmetry for the following quadratic function. F of x equals x squared minus 5. That is the same thing as saying f of x equals x squared plus 0x minus 5. If there's no b term, that means that b had to have a value of 0, because anything times 0 is 0. So if I do my x equals negative b divided by 2a, in this case, a is 1, b is 0, and c is negative 5. So this is negative 0 divided by 2 times 1, which is 0 divided by 2. So x equals 0. And this is going to happen anytime there is no b value. So when there is no b value, your axis of symmetry is always going to be x equals 0. Because 0 divided by, it doesn't matter what your a value is, 0 divided by anything is always going to be 0. So when you have no b value, no x term, your axis of symmetry is always going to be x equals 0, which simply means your axis of symmetry is always going to be the y-axis in that case. It means we are not translating the parabola left or right. Your axis of symmetry is going to be on the y-axis, which means your vertex is going to be on the y-axis. And in this case, if we were to substitute that 0 in and find f of 0, that would be 0 squared plus 0 times 0 minus 5. So 0 plus 0 minus 5 means f of 0 is negative 5. So we have an axis of symmetry of x equals 0 and a vertex at 0, negative 5. What do you notice about the y value of the vertex? The vertex is at 0, negative 5. What do you notice about that negative 5? Where else did we see that negative 5 in this problem? So when you do not have a b value, your vertex is going to be on the y-axis, and your c value is going to tell you where on the y-axis it's going to be because of the zeros there. Now, we are actually going to add in a little bit something to this lesson. We're going to add in some practice on solving functions or substituting in functions. So I have a worksheet that I'm going to hand out, and then we're going to go over some problems together. Again, a little extra practice on evaluating quadratic functions to make sure we're substituting in correctly and we're doing the math correctly. So the first one says f of x equals the quantity x plus 3 squared minus 2x squared. And they want us to evaluate that when x equals negative 12. So they're saying f of negative 12 equals, wherever I see x, I'm going to substitute in that negative 12. So the quantity negative 12 plus 3 squared minus 2 times negative 12 squared. You have to make sure you're using those parentheses appropriately. And that goes for your calculator as well. When you are putting this into the calculator, you have to make sure that you are putting the parentheses in the calculator. Otherwise, you are going to do the wrong math. So if I look at my calculator here, I have to start my parenthesis, negative 12 plus 3, end my parenthesis, And I want to square that value, so I hit my square key here. There's an x squared key that I can hit, and it'll give me a second power. Minus 2, parenthesis, negative 12, parenthesis, and again squared. So you have to make sure when you enter that into your calculator that you're using the parentheses in the appropriate places so that we get the correct answers. And what would we get after we put this in our calculator? Yeah, we should get negative 207 would be the correct value. And where that comes from, okay, if we go back here and look at the math individually, f of negative 12 equals, well, negative 12 plus 3 is negative 9 squared, minus 2 times negative 12 squared is 144. So f of negative 12 equals 81 minus 288 to give us that f of negative 12 equals negative 207. I want you to try number 2 there to evaluate f of x equals negative 5x plus 4x squared when x equals negative 6. So they're asking for f of negative 6. So we have negative 5 times negative 6 plus 4 times negative 6 squared. I'm going to pause for a moment while you work that out. So what do we get for f of negative 6? 174. We should get f of negative 6 equals 174. Again, if we go back and look at the problem, negative 5 times negative 6 is positive 30, plus 4 times 36. When I square negative 6, I get positive 36. So it's 30 plus 144. Again, it comes down to making sure you're putting those parentheses around those negative signs and doing the correct math. And part of that is learning how to use our calculator. Make sure we're inputting it into the calculator correctly. You notice you could do that entire equation in the calculator. You don't have to do it in little parts. You can put the entire thing into the calculator, just making sure you have your parentheses in the correct place. So part B, f of x equals the quantity 3x minus 14 squared, and they want us to find f of 11. So f of 11 means I'm going to take 3 times 11 minus 14, and I'm going to square that. How I put that in my calculator to make sure that I am putting that in correctly. So I have to start off parentheses because I had a quantity. I have 3 times 11, so I do 3 parenthesis 11 parenthesis minus 14, and then I have to finish the outside parentheses, and to square it again I have this x squared key. I hit that and it'll put the square for me. And what does this come out to equal? Yeah, 361, but you have to make sure the calculator is only going to do the math you ask it to do, so you have to make sure that when you are putting this in the calculator, you are putting it in correctly. So f of 11 equals 361. So I'll pause for a moment while you do number 2. F of x equals negative x squared. Find f of negative 5. And on this one, you need to be careful because there's a negative in front of the x squared. So you have f of negative 5 equals negative 5 squared. That negative in front of the x comes after you square the x. So what do I get for f of negative 5 here? Negative 25. When we square the negative 5, we get positive 25, but then we have that negative 1 outside that we have to multiply times it. So we would get negative 25. All right, part C. You have one equation and 3 different substitutions. I'm going to pause for a moment while you complete all 4 problems in part C.
You have to show our work.
You at least have to show the substitution, yes. All right, so what did we get for f of negative 15? 317. So if we're using those parentheses appropriately, we should get 317. What about f of 12? 47. F of 0? It is not 0. Should be negative 13. You have 0 minus 13. You have to make sure you account for that negative 13. And what about f of 6? Negative 19. Again, it comes down to making sure that we are inputting into the calculator correctly. Now, I will say part D is a little bit tougher. Part D, they're asking you to do some substitutions and then do some math with those substitutions. So if we look in this first one, we have to find out what is f of 1 and what is f of 0 before we can do the other math. So f of 1 would be the quantity 1 minus 2 squared. So f of 1 would be negative 1 squared, which would be positive 1. F of 0 would be 0 minus 2 quantity squared. So f of 0 is negative 2 squared, which is positive 4. Now I have to do the other math. So I have 4 times 1 times 6 times 4, which is 4 times 24, which equals 96. So we have to do the function part first, and then do the math they want us to do with the function part. Number 2, we have to do the function of 2 and the function of 4 before we can do the math they're asking. So the function of 2 would be 2 minus 2 quantity squared. So the function of 2 is 0 squared, which is 0. And the function of 4 is 4 minus 2 squared. So the function of 4 is 2 squared, which is 4. So I have negative 8 times 0 plus 3 times 4. So 0 plus 12 equals 12. The third one here, we have to find f of 7 and f of -8 to be able to combine those. So f of 7 is 7 minus 2 quantity squared. So f of 7 is 5 squared, which is 25. F of -8 is -8 minus 2 quantity squared. F of -8 is -10 squared, which will be 100. So we have -7 times 25 plus 100. So -175 plus 100 would equal -75. And then on the fourth one, we have to find f of -1 and f of 3 to be able to do the math. So f of -1 would be -1 minus 2 quantity squared. So f of -1 would be -3 squared, which would be positive 9. And then f of 3 would be 3 minus 2 quantity squared. So f of 3 would be 1 squared, which is 1. So -3 times 9 divided by 1 is -27 divided by 1 is -27. So anytime they're asking you to do math with a function, you have to find out what is the value of the function first before you can do the math with it. And then E, what is the value of f of -3 if f of x equals 10x squared plus 8? I'm going to pause for a moment while you work that last one out. So what do we get for f of -3 if f of x equals 10x squared plus 8? Well, we get 10 times 9 plus 8. 90 plus 8 will give us 98. This is the correct answer. We are attaching this worksheet to page, I think it's 16, the back side of the notes we just finished. This is not the quiz review. This is the back side. This is an extra page that wasn't originally going to be in our packet, but the Math 3 teachers were talking about that last year's Math 2 students weren't doing good on function substitution or function notation. So on page 16, we're going to either staple or you can use your glue stick out of your thing and put a stripe of glue just at the top and put it on that empty page 16 in your notebook.